What up, y'all? This is Patrick Hayes, and in this video I want to talk about zone out culture. What I mean by zone out culture is how humanity has a tendency to zone out due to all the various issues that we're dealing with. So what I want to go over in this video is some of the key things that cause people to zone out, so I can kind of diagnose some of the issues that are going on. And then if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to make it very, very clear how we can use different techniques to actually tune ourselves back in and wake back up, because this is something that all of us need to pay attention to. All of us have different tendencies to say, go more asleep, or avoid certain things, or misinterpret our reality in different ways. And it's up to us to learn how to stimulate ourselves back into awareness so that we can be clear and we can be conscious and we can keep showing up in the world like we would like to show up. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the idea of trauma and how trauma can disconnect us from our reality. And it's something that everybody experiences to a certain degree, and everybody's definitely seen in other people. So one good example that we could probably all relate to is the iconic idea of a woman who thinks she's fat that is constantly misinterpreting her reality in order to fit this image that she's fat. So it's like a confirmation bias. She's misinterpreting the reality to fit some idea that inside her head she tells herself she's fat. So you could be saying something like, here, check out this like dress in a store, and she's like, whoa, what are you saying, that like I'm fat? You know the situations where it's like you didn't say that at all, but they misinterpreted what you were saying to fit some idea of some sort of thing that they're actually traumatized with on some level. So this goes across the board, and people, when we get really sensitive to things, right? If there are certain things that we're particularly sensitive to, it's because we've been traumatized, most likely, in one way or another. And so when something comes up and it reminds us of that, we don't actually see the reality. What we see is we see through the lens of that trauma, and then we have an overreaction to that. So we have a traumatic response to it. So this is really common, and this is a way of that we zone out from our reality, right? And we actually zone into a past realm of emotional distress or a past somatic trauma that we're stuck in. And so we're actually not experiencing reality as it is. Okay, so the second one I want to talk about is info overwhelm or severity overwhelm. And this is something that's really common for humanity right now because of all of the information that we're having to process all the time, and the severity of a lot of the information that we're having to process. So what it actually means when we have to look at the Amazon burning, or when we have to look at oil being spilled in the ocean, like what that actually means. So the severity of things, and then also the sheer overwhelm of all the information that we have coming in. What this can drive us to do, and commonly does, is to just tune out. You're like, well, I don't know what to do with this. This is just too much information. I don't know how to process it. I don't know how to make sense of it. So I'm just gonna like focus on something else, right? But the issue here is that we're not addressing something, and then there's a kind of anxiety or stress that builds in us because we're avoiding something that we know on some level is really important, and we shouldn't be ignoring it, but we don't know what to do with it, so we just ignore it. And it's true, we don't have the processing power to process all the different things going on. So what do we do here? And I'll get into this in the end, but this is an issue that we all have to deal with, and it's intense because there's never been this much information to process ever in our history. Now, the third one I want to talk about is hypnosis. And hypnosis, I'm using it to cover a wide spectrum of things. So hypnosis could be anything associated with addiction, an addiction to a thought, an addiction to a different emotional state, an addiction to an idea, an addiction to food, an addiction to sports, an addiction to porn, an addiction to drugs, any kind of addiction. Anything where we compulsively keep taking action on something even though it's causing drama in our life or causing problems. So beyond just the traditional addictions that we're all aware of and some of the things I mentioned, this also includes addiction to certain ideologies or certain programmed ideas of what we are, what humans are, like the idea that masculinity is fully toxic, or like all women are crazy, or all men are shallow, or like these kinds of different paradigm programs that have been pervasive amongst the consciousness, right? So these are all kind of like hypnosis programs, and these are all forms of tuning out or zoning out, because instead of taking a reality for what it is and really looking at what our true experience is, and then thinking about that and making a decision from a place of sovereignty from that. Well, we're taking certain things for granted, or we're not evaluating certain things, and we're just like moving off of compulsion into an old way of seeing things or an old way of behaving that's obviously not working for us. So in a sense, we're avoiding reality. So what do we do about this? Well, like I said, this is something that everyone deals with. And I think that this is something that if anyone was to say that they were completely above this, that they're not being fully honest, or at least they're not being cautious enough with their approach to life. Because I think this is something that we always need to be aware of. We always need to be, in a sense, kind of like waking ourselves up, like, yo, pay attention. What's actually going on here? Because it's really easy to slip into these patterns. Now, one of the things that I've used that's been really helpful for me, and I use on a regular basis, is you could call it like a kind of mindful meditation, right? But essentially it's being able to tune into my energy body, or tune into my feeling body, my somatic awareness, right? So what my body's telling me, what my emotions are telling me, what the senses in my feelings are telling me. Because what this does is this starts tuning us into different areas where we are zoning out or tuning out. And it does that by acting like a kind of sense perception that informs us of something, right? So instead of being so mind dominated, of making sense and only processing everything through the mind, being aware of what we're feeling, and then starting to understand what those feelings are indicating to us. So for the example of trauma, an indication that we're dealing with a kind of trauma is that when certain things come up, there's a split second of usually panic or fear that is associated with a past trauma that we've experienced. And that panic or fear comes up, and it's usually just for a very split second before it kicks us into a kind of patterned response. If you do some mindful meditation where you actually meditate and work to clear your mind, what you'll start noticing is that as you're doing these meditations, that different fear responses will come up while you're in the meditation. So you're not actually having out external stimulus that's triggering the fear, but that will start rising to the surface when you start clearing yourself out. And then these kinds of dramas or these kinds of things that you're afraid of, they'll start showing up, and you'll think about them and start worrying about them while you're meditating. So this is a great opportunity for you to start identifying where they're coming from. And then what you can start to notice is that in your dreams, if you have a good dream recall, this is a great technique to draw upon. If in your dreams you are playing out a lot of these fear scenarios that are associated with your trauma, and also in your everyday life, there are moments that for a split second, this fear will come up, and then you'll kick into a certain response. And you start becoming aware of that. And then once you become aware of it, you can start feeling it as it happens and start identifying where the fears are, and then getting to the bottom of those fears, to the bottom of those traumas. And then you start letting those traumas go by reassuring yourself, by doing different processing work, and reassuring yourself that you're actually safe and that you don't need to perceive the reality through that same lens. This also goes with things like I mentioned earlier, like somebody has taken on this idea that they are a bad person or a dumb person or ugly or whatever it is. They've taken on this idea and they've internalized that. Well, when you're in that space, what's actually happening is that, first off, it's distorted. It's not actually the reality, right? To tell yourself you're ugly is not actually the reality. That's an opinion. And you've introjected an opinion onto yourself, and you're holding judgment for yourself. And so you can think that, like, well, I've accepted I'm just an ugly person, or I've accepted I'm just a stupid person. You can think that you're accepting the reality then. But actually what you're doing is you're judging yourself, and then you're trying to accept the judgment within yourself. But what that is that's creating a conflict within yourself, that you're saying, okay, well, I'm not going to resolve this conflict because this conflict is just part of my life. But realize there are a lot of things coming down the pipe in your reality that you're responding to based off of the different traumas or the different sensitivities you have that are causing you to misinterpret the reality. So when you can feel that fear or that trauma or that self-judgment, this points you in the direction of where to start doing your personal work, to where to start tuning in and where to start clearing out old useless belief systems that are no longer serving you. Now, when you're dealing with information overwhelm or severity overwhelm, this is something that This is tricky because we don't have enough time to process all the stuff going on in our reality. But there's a difference between processing something enough to realize that in order for you to do the best you can to make the things better in the world that need to be made better, and in your life to make your life better, that your time is better spent solving different problems that, in a sense, add to the greater solution in one way or another, is absolutely different than just ignoring something and saying like, well, I feel anxious about this thing, I haven't processed it at all, and now I'm just gonna avoid it, right? When we're faced with information that makes us feel uneasy, we can process enough of it to realize whether this is something that we need to actually take action to start processing and start figuring out solutions for, or whether our time and our contribution to the world, or just the amount of time that we have to contribute to bettering our own lives, is better served by focusing more specifically on certain things. So being able to tune into this on an energy or somatic level is, it's actually easy because everybody's had the experience of procrastinating or avoiding something. So think about a time when you knew you had to do something and you put that thing off and it sat as an anxiety inside of you. And now, however subtle or intense that anxiety was, you know what that feeling, the nature of that feeling is like. Well, essentially it's the same kind of feeling where you see something on TV or you hear something from a friend and it creates this anxiety in you, and then you focus on something else instead and that anxiety just kind of sits there. But it's an open loop until you go back and close the loop, and you close the loop by going back and processing it enough to see what it is that you can actually do practically that at least indirectly helps this problem. And by doing that, then you know you're at least doing everything that you can, and you can let go of that anxiety that's building inside of you. The anxiety really builds inside people that really know deep down that they're not really doing anything, that they're part of the problem, and they're not at least trying to be part of the solution. This really eats people up inside, and this is a major cause of a lot of the zoning out that I'm talking about. Well, I'm just going to focus on, my football team, or I'm just going to focus on making a bunch of money because, there's nothing I can do to deal with this problem. Well, there is something you can do to deal with the problem, and that's do something to make the world a better place. And then that anxiety won't be so intense. Now, the third one's hypnosis. So how do we bring mindfulness to hypnosis so that we can overcome some of the maybe like addictive habits that we have, or the addiction to different pathological paradigms that we have. So being able to tune into and become aware of, become mindful of a kind of addiction vibe or a hypnosis vibe is being able to tune into when your mind is being puppeted or taken over by a compulsion. And there's a very distinct feeling that you feel when you're being taken over by a compulsion. And essentially what it is that there's a gnawing or a pulling at you on an energetic level. You feel this as a pulling. And then what happens is it starts pulling you in a particular direction, and then your mind goes back and starts either justifying what you're doing or just completely is not even aware that you're doing it in the first place. So a good example of this is like, if you ever had the experience where you're eating potato chips and then you're like, okay, this is enough, I've had too many potato chips. You're driving your car, so you like put them underneath the seat in the back so that you don't eat them anymore. And you're driving, and the next thing you know, like you're eating potato chips again. You're like, how did that happen, right? So your mind completely tuned out. But there was a pulling that pulled you, a sensation of pulling that pulled you and pulled your body to make that decision. That's very much like a compulsion kind of addiction vibe. Now, oftentimes what happens is that when it's bigger decisions, not just like grabbing a piece of chips, but like going and like having to score a drug, or like going to like watch porno or something like that. What's happening is that we're being pulled, and we can feel that pull, but our mind isn't equipped to process it properly. So the mind then justifies the pulling. So essentially the mind is being puppeted by the compulsion. And you can feel that when you start tuning into it. And how you can do this is that when you meditate, you'll start noticing that these compulsions come up, ideas of the things that we're addicted to start popping into our head. And then we can feel that feeling of the pulling, and it's almost like a butterflies in the stomach. It's like an anxious excitement to go do this thing. And when you feel that, then you start becoming aware of what it feels like to be pulled in the direction of addiction. And when you're aware of that, then you become more conscious of it when it happens in your daily life, and then you can make the distinction. If you're being pulled, oh, wait a second. Okay, I'm being pulled here. So don't let my mind start justifying what I'm doing, because this is not actually, I'm not making this decision from an integrated part of myself. This decision is being made from some kind of lower desire pulling, and I'm just using my mind to justify that action as opposed to really think out what is the right thing for me to do. It also goes this way with having different ideologies that we're addicted to. Like, a big one that I remember seeing when I was growing up was that like women are crazy. Like they're crazy, they just act crazy, and like, you can never understand a woman, she's just gonna be crazy and emotional and all this kind of thing. And oftentimes, like they had legitimate reason for why they were being emotional, but I wasn't willing to tune into the reality to actually figure out what was going on and understand more clearly what the actual situation was and what her perception was and what she was experiencing. I would just click into this, oh, she's being crazy, and now I gotta kind of like tiptoe around that because she's being crazy. And this is another form of hypnosis that you can tune into the vibration of. Well, and it's a vibration of avoidance. It's a vibration of like, I'm freezing up, I don't know what to do. I'm gonna shift into this idea of how I deal with this situation all the time, instead of looking at the real situation. So it's like a freezing up. You feel like a freezing up and like a tensity, and then you like just revert to an old pattern that actually is quite autopilot, right? So if those kind of situations turn you into this kind of like autopilot space, that's an indication that you're not looking at the reality fully, but you're freezing up and kind of like shifting into another programmed response. But all these are sensations to look out for, right? The sensation of freezing up, right? The sensation of butterflies in the stomach and anxiety, compulsion that's pulling you towards something. A sensation of avoidance, of like, oh God, that's too much to deal with. I'm just going to look over here instead. And now I'm feeling this anxiety because I'm avoiding something. A sensation of fear or panic, right? Trauma, like, oh no, this thing's happening. Now I'm going into this unconscious zone. All these are sensations. When you start meditating and becoming aware of what these feel like, and they will come up when you're working on clearing your mind. And when you feel them come up in that space, that's when you learn how to identify the actual sensation. And once you can identify the sensation, then you can start carrying that awareness over into your everyday life. You can start modulating your behavior so you can be more present and more aware to what the actual reality is and what the true experience is. So that's all I have for you today. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Patrick Hayes. Like, subscribe. If this video is useful for you, or you know anyone else that this video would be useful for, please share it. I'd really appreciate that. If you have any questions or comments, put them in the comments below, and I'd be happy to answer them. And if you'd like me to make more videos on this, let me know what kind of videos or what areas of this video you'd like me to go more into depth about. So again, thanks for tuning in. This is Patrick Hayes, and I'll talk to you next time. One love.